For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Do you remember that film, the Zeitgeist movie that came out a number of years ago and caused a bit of a stir? Well, there's an ancient history portion of the film, which I began reviewing in a previous video, by the way. If you haven't seen it and you want to go check it out, I'll leave a link for you below. In that one, I talked about the claims made by the film's writer, Peter Joseph, about the Egyptian god Horus. It turns out he didn't know his history all that well, but that's because he got his information from some faulty sources. This time, we're going to look at his claims about other ancient gods, Attis, Krishna, Dionysus, and Mithras. And I'll share with you some correspondence I had with Peter Joseph about the movie back in 2007. I saved the emails. Let's just say we didn't see eye to eye. There's a phenomenon in comparative studies that sometimes is referred to as parallelomania. It refers to the obsession with finding parallels in two pieces of literature and then making more out of the parallels than is justified. This is not something unique to pseudo-history or fringe research. Scholars themselves have fallen prey to it. In the 20th century in particular, it became very popular to find parallels in literary works and then take them a little too far. Don't get me wrong, comparisons of this sort have proven very valuable in helping us to understand literature better. Literary parallels exist, and literary influence exists. Sources do copy other sources. We call it parallelomania only when more is made of the parallels than is actually there. For example, when the similarities are trivial or have to be taken out of context in order to be able to work. Or when literary dependence is assumed because of these parallels, as if one directly copied from the other, when reality is actually more complicated than that. In more recent times, scholars have become aware of their past over-eagerness in this regard and have tempered their extravagances. But this approach is still very popular among amateur researchers. Now, what does this have to do with the Zeitgeist movie? In Zeitgeist, we're told that numerous ancient gods had stories about them that bear striking resemblance to accounts about Jesus of Nazareth, and that this is an indication that the accounts about Jesus were in fact plagiarized from pagan stories. Now, let me say right off the bat that I'm not coming at this from a Christian point of view. I'm approaching this as a historian. There is no doubt that certain parts of the commonly accepted narrative about Jesus came from paganism, such as that he was born on December 25th, for example. I just want to examine how well this movie represents ancient beliefs, and if it's suffering from parallelomania. I mean, that's the purpose of this series, right? To correct popular misconceptions about the past. And the claims of this film have proved to be highly influential over the last decade and a half. But how much does it get right? Let's continue where we left off last time.
For many other gods are found to have the same general mythological structure. Attis of Phrygia, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days was resurrected.
Is this true? In the myth of Attis, was he born of a virgin on December 25th, crucified, placed in a tomb, and resurrected after 3 days? No. In my email exchange with Peter Joseph, the film's creator, here's what I wrote. Regarding Attis, the daughter of the god of the Sangarius River conceived Attis not by sexual intercourse, but by taking the fruit of an almond tree that had grown up from the sexual organ of Agdistis, which the gods had cut off. But as you can see, a penis was still involved, as in the case of Isis. Perhaps it would be best to change the wording on all of these from born of a virgin to born without sexual intercourse, or something like that. Attis was not crucified, and there's no myth of which I'm aware that says he was buried for 3 days. Peter Joseph wrote me back, saying, Attis was conceived by immaculate conception, which is mythologically synonymous with virgin birth. Well, immaculate conception is not mythologically synonymous with virgin birth. First of all, Immaculate Conception refers to being born without sin. But if Peter means simply being born without sex, it's still not the same as virgin birth, mythologically or otherwise. Because in myth, a woman who is not a virgin is capable of having a child without sex. The story involving the conception of Attis, which I referred to, comes from the writer Arnobius from the 3rd century CE. How old that story is and whether it originated before the Jesus story, we don't know. But if the almond that impregnated Nana grew from a penis, her eating it is pretty much just a fanciful way of having sex. He continues, Attis castrated himself and laid against a tree in cruciform. The myth very clearly says that Attis castrated himself. But this is not a crucifixion. None of the versions of the myth say he was crucified. Peter's backtracking from what he said in the movie, and now says Attis laid against a tree in cruciform. That's a stretch. No pun intended. Peter is claiming that Attis leaned on a tree in a pose resembling crucifixion. I could find none of that in any of the versions of the Attis myth. It describes how he is killed, and in most versions by a wild boar. In others by a stray spear during a boar hunt. Nothing resembling a crucifixion. In fact, there's no mention of his resurrection in the extant versions of the myth either. There is mention of a pine tree. In one version, after he castrates himself, he lays down under a pine tree and dies there. Under the tree, not on it. In other versions, he turns into a pine tree. Peter continues, Now, the question comes down to what is more important, the tradition or the myth, in certain circumstances. So what he means here is that maybe the myth is not as important as the tradition, and by tradition, he refers to the religious rites performed in honor of Attis. He says, the Passion of Attis played out every year. In Roman something, in the 1st century, pinned an effigy of Attis to a tree in cruciform at the vernal equinox. It was in practice. They then placed him in a cave for 3 days and then brought him out as resurrected. What he says here is basically correct. In Roman times, there was a festival to Attis every year in the spring, and this festival was based on the myth of Attis. And during it, they celebrated Attis's resurrection from the dead. So although we don't have reference to his resurrection in the surviving versions of the myths, we have it commemorated in the festival. So clearly a popular version of the myth had the resurrection. But here's the thing. The versions of the myth that we have are from a time earlier than the festival was instituted. The resurrection of Attis appears to be a late innovation to his story. Scholars think it became part of the Attis myth in the 2nd century CE, which is after the first Christian Gospels were written. As for the timing of the festival, it was celebrated in March. The Day of Blood, as it was called, observed on March 24th, with an effigy of Attis placed in a tomb, and the rejoicing on March 25th, 1 day later, when Attis' resurrection was celebrated. So not 3 days, but 1 day. He continues, what it comes down to is that this is the same for Jesus. Jesus was paganized just like Attis. The traditions were the same. For example, nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus was born on December 25th, yet that is the way it is celebrated. I'm in total agreement with that. Jesus was paganized over the centuries. Nothing new or groundbreaking about that. But is that really all the movie's trying to show? No. It's trying to argue that the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection after 3 days, as described in the Gospels, was borrowed whole cloth from pagan myth. Well, show us a pagan myth from before the time of the Gospels, then, that tells that story. Then you'll have something. Attis wasn't it.
Krishna of India, born of the Virgin Devaki with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and, upon his death, was resurrected.
All right, so here's another piece of evidence that he provides. How true are these claims? Well, here's what I wrote to him in response. I don't know much about Krishna, but I would suggest you check your facts to be sure of this. I heard that he was born to the princess Devaki and her husband Vasudeva. I don't know of any star in the east myth associated with him, and I've never heard of a death and resurrection story for him either. He wrote back saying, Krishna is the Indian Christ. Krishna as it used to be spelled. Oh my. I wish he was kidding me here, but he's serious. He's using a similarity in the English spellings of the names to link the two. And trying to establish connection based on a similar sound is not a valid form of argument, because there are many similar sounding names all over the world that have no connection to each other whatsoever. He continues, just like Mary, who, whether they like to cover it up, had other children, such as James, Jesus' brother, so it was with Krishna. Devaki had 7 children, so did Mary, by the way, in certain scriptures. I don't know of any scriptures that say that Mary had 7 children. But in Hindu myth, Devaki had 7 children before she had Krishna, which means she was not a virgin when she had him. He continues, there are mythologists going back 900 years who speak of his immaculate/virgin conception. Nowhere in the Hindu Vedas, I think he means Vedas, or the like, does it say how Krishna was born. And since Devaki was with a non-mortal husband, the Immaculate Conception card is obvious and with much precedent. In one version of the myth of Krishna's birth, the god Vishnu pulled a hair from his head and placed it into Devaki's womb. Tales about strange ways of conception are common in mythology. But this bears no resemblance to the story of Jesus' birth. I mean, you can say, yeah, but there was no sex, all you want. But it's not similar. Besides, should we assume that communication between these two parts of the world was common? How would the early Christians, peasants from the Eastern Roman Empire, have heard anything about Krishna?
Dionysus of Greece, born of a virgin on December 25th, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles such as turning water into wine. He was referred to as the King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, the Alpha and Omega, and many others. And, upon his death, he was resurrected.
Here's what I wrote to Peter about this section. Regarding Dionysus, he is the son of Zeus and Semele in some myths, and the son of Zeus and Persephone in others. I know of no virgin birth story, though there are some versions that have him born from 2 mothers and 1 father. I also know of no evidence that he was born on December 25th. His festival was in March. This was Peter's reply. Dionysus was born with no intercourse. Zeus impregnated Semele with a thunderstorm. His festival was in March at the vernal equinox, or Easter. Peter again is using the lowest common denominator, birth without sex, to try to establish a connection with Jesus. But the idea of a God being conceived through unusual means instead of in the mundane way is so widespread in the ancient world, across cultures, across languages, across oceans, that any claim that they must be connected somehow is ridiculous in the extreme. The thing about the December 25th date, for a lot of these gods, is that people just associate the god with the sun god in some way. And then they can say that since the sun god's birth was at the time of the winter solstice, you've got a December 25th birthday. Dionysus was occasionally associated with Helios, the sun god. But what that means is that there really only is one Greek god born on December 25th, Helios, the sun god. That's it. These other gods can't be used as additional examples. As for the festival of Dionysus, the Dionysia, if you want to establish that Easter was a ripoff of it, then you need something more than just that the dates are kind of around the same time. Is there any significant similarity in the contents of the events? That's what you want to look at, right? But I already agree that Easter was largely influenced by pagan celebrations, maybe even the festival of Dionysus. But the celebration of Easter isn't in the Gospels, so this doesn't have any bearing on Christianity's origins. And I looked and looked, but I could find no evidence that Dionysus was ever called King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, or the Alpha and the Omega. Was Dionysus resurrected? Well, there is a story about him going to the underworld to rescue his mother and then returning. That's about as close as you're going to get. The details of the story are so different from that of Jesus that it would be hard to make a case that one was based on the other. Bear in mind that in the earliest versions of the Jesus account, Jesus isn't even a god.
Mithra of Persia, born of a virgin on December 25th. He had 12 disciples and performed miracles, and upon his death was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected. He was also referred to as the Truth, the Light, and many others. Interestingly, the sacred day of worship of Mithra was Sunday.
Okay, so how well do these claims stand up to the evidence? Well, the first thing to point out is that there is a conflation of two different gods here. This is what I wrote to him in explanation. Regarding Mithra, I know you are confusing him with Mithras, whose cult resembles Christianity in some ways. Mithra was a Persian deity that has little resemblance to Jesus. Mithras was a Roman deity that does. I don't know about any myths that have him buried for 3 days. And more importantly, Mithraism was contemporaneous with Christianity. And he replied, "Interesting point. I see those names being used interchangeably. I'm referring to the one concurrent with the Zoroaster myth, which is known as both Mithra and Mithras, oddly. Because the Romans claimed that Mithras was the same as the god Mithra, the conflation of the two is understandable. The only thing is, when we compare the actual Persian Zoroastrian beliefs about Mithra, they don't match up well to Mithras at all. The most likely reason for that is that the Romans didn't really understand Zoroastrian beliefs all that well, or didn't care. So we'll just stick to Mithras. And as I said to Peter, there are some interesting similarities with Christianity. But since it has not been established that Mithraism preceded Christianity, we have no solid basis for concluding that ideas about Jesus were drawn from ideas about Mithras, and not the other way around. And although Mithraism has similarities with Christianity, we have found no evidence that the religion believed that their God was born on December 25th, or that he had 12 disciples, or that he died and was resurrected. From what I understand, the claim that he was born on December 25th is because the sun god, Sol Invictus, his birth, was celebrated on that day. He's the sun god. And Mithras is shown in images as banqueting with Sol Invictus. But that doesn't make Mithras the sun. The claim that he had 12 disciples is based on the fact that some images of Mithras were found with the 12 constellations of the zodiac surrounding him. And somehow it has been reasoned that these constellations were his disciples. I don't know where the death and resurrection idea comes from because it's not in any of the ancient sources or images. We're wise to be cautious about exaggerating parallels and about sources and derivation. In dealing with similarities, sometimes we can discover exact parallels, some with significance and some without. Other parallels we may find might be imperfect, they don't match all that well. And others we can create if we take pieces of the story out of context. There is a danger in using only excerpts to study parallels for that reason. And Zeitgeist does that a lot. How much does the story of Attis resemble that of Jesus? They both were killed and came back to life. That's pretty much it. How much does the myth of Krishna resemble that of Jesus? I got nothing. How much does Dionysus resemble Jesus? Dionysus went to the underworld and came back. Jesus went to Hades and came back. They both performed miracles. That's about it. How much does the story of Mithras resemble that of Jesus? Mithras was a savior god that performed miracles. Is there enough here to establish that the Jesus story was based on any of these? Are these parallels consequential? I'll let you be the judge. One more thing. It was pointed out to me that in my previous video on Zeitgeist the movie, I made an error when I said that Plutarch testified that the Egyptians believed Horus was born on December 25th. I was wrong. Yeah, in that passage, Plutarch says that it was not the Egyptians who believed that, but, quote, numerous and tiresome people, unquote, and that they were mistaken. Presumably he means Greeks. So people did believe that about Horus, just not the Egyptians. For the purposes of Zeitgeist, that doesn't really make a difference, right? Because Peter Joseph would just say that the Christians borrowed it from those tiresome Greeks. So I'm still giving Peter a pass on that point. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you like the content of this video, please give it a thumbs up. And take a look at some of the other videos I got on the channel. If you like this one, you may enjoy them too. And we'll see you next time. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world.
You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.